Thank you for the question. Yeah, for me, I would say yes and no, because it actually depends on the publisher. Because sometimes, for instance, I'm coming from Ghana, a developing country. Sometimes reporters actually massage in quotes what somebody wants to be put across, but there are some other publishers who actually quotes and unquotes what people say. So it can be both. Thank you.
So what you're saying is that the credibility of a medium depends on how they operate and how trustworthy they are. You looked like you wanted to say something too.
Thank you. Well, I think media has a lot of things to do, plays a big role, and not always is doing, I don't know, the correct job, or let's say media in my country, I come from Chile, it's not accomplishing the role of the social communications need for science. I think there is a big gap to fill still in that.
Okay, thanks for your contributions. I think we've already seen, and you both mentioned it, that there's a gap between what is published in the media and what is true, and a gap between what is published in the media and what people actually believe. If we dissect these gaps, if you take a closer look at these gaps, we find that information is not knowledge. Information is just bits of knowledge that only make sense if you put them into a coherent context. So you need to know the context to be able to interpret the information. Facts are something different from convictions. Some facts can boost convictions and others will undermine convictions, and if people hold very strong convictions, they will be in denial about certain kinds of facts. So where is determined what people actually believe and know? Do you have an idea? Who decides what a person believes?
Well, thank you. Well, for that question, I would say that it's the individual himself. He determines what to believe. Because, of course, like you're giving us something on how we can get the media understand us as planners, I choose to believe you or not. Based on some facts and figures, I can decide to check their credibility to be sure if what you are giving me, I mean, the sources are very reliable. Then I decide to make a decision. Thank you.
So it's the individual person who decides whether he or she wants to believe something he or she reads in the newspaper. Is there a more complex dynamic to credibility of media?
I believe some important media, especially mass media, are influencing sometimes negatively what people think, and it's from my point of view, sometimes like putting garbage in the mind of the people, just to say it very clear, and especially the small independent media, I think, plays an important role in this, in shaping, I don't know, giving alternatives to people to see there are other histories behind.
Just a little to add, I would also say that sometimes what the media portray, like their publicity or how they actually make the whole thing appealing to the eyes. Sometimes I may not be interested in reading a magazine or something, but how you organize your information to the public, for me, it might attract me. Maybe I might not be interested in the news, but your packaging and your credibility and how you come out with your information can also motivate me to read or not.
Okay, so we do see that the media have an input into what people think about, but they don't have a direct link into what they think. What they think, as you said, or what they believe is very much up to the individual person, and it's very much shaped by that person's interaction with other people, especially people they consider credible. So to a large extent, what the general interest media do is define topics that are considered relevant and that are then discussed. And that happens in the family, in the marketplace, at church, in the mosque, wherever people gather and where they're among peers or superior leaders that they trust, that they will start defining whether they believe what is in the paper or not. Academic research on the impact of media has again and again shown that the media have an agenda setting and gatekeeping function, but do not directly shape the worldview. The worldview is determined by social interaction, socialization, by the way a person lives his or her life in society, is defined by the family, by religious leaders, and so on, and by the communities they join or belong to voluntarily. Some communities people join voluntarily, others they belong to because they were born into them. Either way or another, the public discourse is shaped by the agenda and the topics that the media define, and to what extent what is written in the media is believed depends on whether they are perceived to be true or not. If newspapers tend to be very sensationalist, people are excited about what they see on television or what they read in the newspaper, but they know that it's low quality or it's high quality. There is a certain feeling for it. But no matter whether a paper is very credible or not, it has this agenda setting function because the public depends on somebody defining what is important. And it is important for us to understand at this point that objective truth and media freedom are not the same. They are interrelated. The media cannot really have an independent, cannot have a credible function of agenda setting unless they have a sense of credibility. And they cannot have that if they're always defined by some power. But at the same time, having media freedom to report what they want as they choose, as they believe is most important, does not lead to them reporting objective truth. What is the difference between, I'll put it another way. Unfree media only have a limited credibility. That's even more restricted than the credibility of media in the first place, and are therefore only of limited use if you want to shape people's opinion and worldview. It will always only work if the media gets in touch with the communities that shape opinions. So if a medium has credibility in the eyes of a certain community, then it can shape that community's worldview. To give an example, if a community has a strong religious feeling and is very closely tied to the Catholic Church, then a publication issued by the Catholic Church will have more authority than one that is not linked to this kind of source of power. The interesting thing, the dynamics of a free media society is that we can have opposing views in the same medium, and we can have opposing views in various media, which allows people to compare and make comparisons, which again adds to the credibility of the media as such. Important thing, if we want to cooperate with them, if we want them to carry our messages, is to stay aware of the fact that they are not in a position to actually convey the truth to the people, because the people decide from themselves what they think is true, and B, the media as such are in no privileged position to determine what is true or not. What they can do is collect various views and compare various views. I would now like to go on to the second point after having like to repeat this message. The media are important as agenda setters, but cannot act as independent conveyors of truth. If we want to interact with them, we need to get an idea of how they operate. Because if you know how somebody operates and how somebody ticks, then you have a better chance of interacting in a successful way with that person. There's been a lot of research on how the media operate, and very early on it was said that really the function of the media is to keep the gates, to let the most important information through, and to retain information that does not matter to the general and public. At first, scholars who did research on the media had the feeling that the journalists were doing what they individually thought was important. But later research showed that there's actually patterns to how editorial staffs operate, and that is always very similar. Institutional factors and constraints play an important role in what makes headlines and what gets covered by the media and what does not get covered. Now, the first constraints are very obvious and simple. It's if you have a newspaper with 4 pages, you can publish stories on 4 pages. You do not have a 5th page. If you have a 10-minute broadcasting program, anything that would fit in your 12th minute will not be covered. That is very plain. You only have as much broadcasting time as you have, and you cannot squeeze more time out of the program. Another thing is time constraints. You can only publish something that is finished by your deadline. If it's not finished, you can't publish it. You need to publish by the deadline. These things are very strict and very basic. But they do mean that we cannot cover truth as such. Most German newspapers today covered the fact that Germany beat Brazil 7-1 in the semifinals in Belo Horizonte. Last night in Germany, yesterday in Brazil. But if you buy the national papers, they don't have the story yet because they were printed before the game was over. It's very simple. The news wasn't ready for publication, so it's not in the paper yet. This is a very strict principle, which then again has consequences on what is considered good news and what is not considered good news. And in this case, good news does not mean that the news is good in the sense of leading to happiness and being positive, but it means a good news story is something that will catch people's interest. One of the they speak of news values. A story has to have certain news values to catch the attention of journalists. And one of the most prominent values is rareness. If something happens every day, it's not news. The morning traffic jam is annoying, it's bothersome, but it's not news. A traffic jam on a Sunday afternoon because some celebrity is visiting can be news because it's unusual. Another thing that is very important for a news value is there has to be consensus on what it means. Typically, accidents are bad. Accidents are rare and accidents are bad. People are killed, people are wounded, property is destroyed. Everybody knows that it's terrible when a house burns down and 3 people die. So that's the kind of story that will catch attention. Another news value is the dimension. If somebody burns down, if a garden hut burns down somewhere, that is not news. If a house for 2 families burns down, it's local news. If a big office building burns down, it makes national news. So these things always have to be put into proportion. And it has been, it is very obvious that negative news is good news. Most news that is covered is bad news and not good news. Do you have an idea why that would be the case? What's the reason why bad news is good news and good news doesn't make the news so easily?
Well, thank you for that question. I was still actually thinking through to be, make a synergy between why good news will be like bad and vice versa. That's the question. Well, for me, I think bad news will be bad to the people that are affected, but the others, it might be good to them. For instance, the Germany and Brazil World Cup semifinals, it was bad news for the Brazilians, but good for the Deutschland people. So it depends on the side of the coin you are looking at it from. Thank you.
Well, I think it's because basically it attracts the attention of the people. Bad news is, I don't know if it's for more or what, but people feel attracted to that kind of, and that is interesting for the media, I think. It's in a way to sell a story.
In very many cases, to pick up your point, the bad news is clearer than the good news. Most people agree on what is bad news, whether something else is good news if it doesn't concern me personally. If a major corporation makes a profit and I don't own shares in that company, it doesn't concern me. If a major corporation closes down a businesses and people lose their jobs, then everybody says, oh, what will these poor people do? The negative aspect is something we have a stronger sense of sharing than the positive aspect. And the negative aspect is often closer tied to an event. It's very hard to report about peace building in Palestine and Israel. There's a lot going on. There are people who are trying to build bridges, who are trying to establish contact, but it's not a news story to say that a Palestinian and Israeli youth group had a nice chat with one another. That's not news. So they had a chat, so what? Who's interested? But if one side killed someone from the other side and then the other side retaliates with killing, then we have something that has drama, that has events, that is strongly negative. And this kind of dimension means the event character of makes it more likely to be covered by news than something that is a slow, ongoing process. And it adds to the impression that the world is bad. If you focus on the media, you get the impression that a lot of bad things happen, nothing good happens, which is that good events are normally not good news, very rarely. You know, if what's her name, Kate has another baby, Princess Kate, if she has another baby, then people consider that good news. But actually, most people don't care very much about the English monarchy. Now, if we want to get the attention of a newsroom, of journalists, we must be aware of that these are the categories they are used to operating in. So we need to offer them some kind of event, some kind of thing that they can cover. We have to bring our message across in their terms, because that's the way they operate. I've already mentioned that journalists always face time pressure because there's always deadlines. You can use that to a certain extent. If you want to get in touch with them, make sure you deliver information at a point where you can get their attention. In Germany, that is typically, if you want to deal with German newspapers, a good time to get a newsroom's attention is between 10 and 12 o'clock in the morning, because that's before they actually start producing the next paper, and it's after they've come to work and after they've had their breakfast. So they're reasonably awake around 10 o'clock, and they'll start being worried about the next paper by about 1 o'clock. Then between that time, they will want to have lunch. And that is the reason why most press conferences in Germany are held at 11 o'clock. You want them to cover something, you want them to convey the message, so you pick a time slot where they'll be available. has nothing to do with how the world is as such or what the truth of the world is. That is really about how does the newsroom operate? What are those people's time schedules? You'll also find that bad news, if a political party has bad news, they try to release it at around 7:45 in the evening. That is right before the main news bulletin in the main television programs. Because if they release it then, you know, they'll say, oh, we have this problem that one of our members of parliament has been accused of a drug problem, and we need to discuss this. So if they leak it at that kind of a point of time, they will not have huge sensationalist coverage immediately, and by the time the others pick up, the story will already be old. So there's a way to manipulate the media if you understand the way they operate. Now, so far I've been talking about what are the newsrooms interested, what are the journalists interested. They are looking for news values like size, dimension, the negativity, the clarity of the event. There's another angle to it, that the media always belong to someone, and that someone is either a private sector business or it's a public sector corporation. And these institutions have interests of their own. They have to stay aware of costs. Now, if the publisher is very cost aware, it means that his editors have less time for research. Obvious, because time costs money and doesn't immediately result in products. Do you know what double marketing is? Every product, every corporation has to market their product, but the media are unique in the sense of doing double marketing. You have any idea what that might be? If I give you the hint and say it's about advertising. The double marketing of the media means they sell the newspaper, and by selling the newspaper, they create a public, the attention of which they sell to advertisers. Public broadcasters don't do that to the same extent. They use taxpayer money to create a public, or forced contributions, which is basically the same as taxpayer money. In Germany, we don't pay television taxes. We pay a contribution to the television broadcasters, but we are forced to pay that, so it's actually a user's tax. They use that money, but that money is not enough, so they generate additional money by doing advertising, which means they try to create a public that advertisers are interested in. And you get a new kind of bias into the whole story. To some extent, it is more interesting to get advertising from car makers such as Daimler-Benz or Mercedes and BMW than from Fiat, because they're more expensive. So they try to cater to a public that is more able to spend. Again, that is something that can distort the reality that is portrayed in the paper, and that will have an impact on how credible people think these papers are. They are tied into their communities that use these media, and that then say, oh, well, they basically, for people with fancy cars. Things like that happen. Again, if we want to deal with them, we would be foolish to believe that just because they're saying we're independent, we're delivering objective news, that they are interested in the truth as the truth in some very emphatical sense. They are in their own business of generating the resources they need to run their own business. And we are better placed to cooperate with them if we understand that role. Am I making sense? Now, if we want to interact with them, we must get a clear idea of what objectivity means in their eyes. For most people who come from universities and from higher learning, they feel that the media are unreliable because they print things that are not necessarily true, that are not necessarily very well informed, and because there is some scholar who knows better and it hasn't been quoted, and it all seems very superficial. Now, for a professional journalist like me, the understanding of objectivity is not this science type kind of objective truth. The idea of objectivity in the media is to basically have the facts correct, not the entire knowledge, but the individual information items, and to rely on more than one source. The general rule is to hear both sides of a story. Again, this is tricky. The principle is very healthy to rely on both sides of a story, but what happens if there's more than two sides to a story? Are there stories that have more than two sides?
Well, I think so. Maybe there are more than two sides also, because you always have like the public side, you have the private side, you have the community side, you have the researchers as another group of influence, and well, I don't know, normal people also play a role, like the people in the street. And those are different public. I think of course, they're not aware of the same things. And the work of the media would be to make that more comprehensive. I still think much more can be done, but it's not being done.
You just said what the job of the media would be. I'm just trying to tell you the way the media tick. The media may not have the idea that their job is to deliver a society-wide consensus. If you have, typically in political reporting, it's government and opposition, which works well in a two-party system for some time. It doesn't work so well if the two major parties in a country form a coalition and two minor parties form the opposition, and the two minor parties tend to be leftist parties, and the two major parties are a conservative and a leftist party, which is the situation we have right now in Germany. In the traditional setting, it would work quite well. The United States has this pattern of Democrats saying this and Republicans saying that. But the old dichotomy of relying on some kind of truth emerging if you quote both sides disappears if, as is recently been the case, one of the leading political parties simply starts denying science. Republicans say evolution theory is just as good as creation theory. There's no such thing as global warming. We don't believe it. Science says yes, but we think it's a hoax. We don't care about macroeconomic theories that don't reflect our views. We know that money should be tied to the gold standard. So you suddenly have a political discourse where one side is trying to come up with facts that are rooted in science, and the other side suddenly denies it. And then does it still make sense to say, well, let's hear both sides and the truth will emerge? It becomes a very distorted truth. Paul Krugman of the New York Times always calls this the he said, she said kind of journalism. And there's a very interesting book that I'd recommend reading if you're interested in these issues. I've listed it, I'll hand out later, by two American journalists who wrote in the past decade, the book was first published in 2000, and then the second edition was published in 2007, who argue that journalists must actually work in pursuit of the truth and not in this conventional sense of hearing both sides of the story. Now, can any newsroom actually live up to that principle? I'm saying we're not doing he said, she said journalism anymore. We're not listening to both sides anymore. We will now go out and discover the truth. Why can that not happen?
Thank you. I think that can't happen because before you can actually put across the relevant facts to the public, you need to listen to both sides. Because like you were putting across, if you have a country with opposition and the government in power, I mean, maybe you being the media, you might be a bit intimidated. It depends on the country in context. Usually the government in power kind of influences most of the media. But even that notwithstanding, you would still need to get the two on board so that at least if you are discussing anything, I mean, we can see the differences. Else it will be too boring. If you look at CNN, they bring people of opposing sides and they discuss matters relevant to the world, and you realize that the discussion makes sense. But if they had just brought one side of the coin, it would be so boring, because for me, before I can make a decision, I have to get the two sides. So, I mean, of course, I don't think the media can do without it to come out with the truth. Yeah.
I absolutely agree with you. The media cannot give up on delivering more than one side of a story, because then it becomes even more biased than it is anyway. But there's another reason why you cannot expect the media to suddenly work in pursuit of the truth rather than doing the both sides approach. And that is simply they don't have the time, they don't have the resources. They don't have the time to do huge investigation. No newsroom can start discovering whether there is such a thing as global warming or not. A newsroom has the capacities to do news research, which is asking people, basically. So what we can do as the public, what we can demand of editors, is that they be diligent about picking the right sources, of being aware that there may be 3 or 4 sides to one story. Typical thing is in business stories. And typically, they will find the opposition of trade unions versus employers. And that's the story that gets covered. But there's another story lingering behind that, and that is the competition, for instance, among car makers. Different car makers are in competition with one another. They do not share the same interest. If they're involved in collective wage bargaining with the same trade union, then they have a shared interest. But Mercedes-Benz and BMW have a lot of things that they do not share, because the one company wants to get the customers of the other company and the other way around. And you have different papers. The business press will be more aware of this competition stuff. But if you really go into energy saving and cars, you suddenly have consumers, you have environmental lobby groups, you have different car manufacturers, and it is up to the journalists to find out what the relevant sources are. I think what we can expect of journalists, and what I personally in my life try to do, is to find the relevant sources and give them space and hope that I've made the right choice. But it's not realistically possible to find out for any journalist whether there is such a thing as climate change or not. That is really up to other institutions. Okay. So we briefly assessed how people shape their view of the world and how knowledge and the media are related. And now we've discovered that it really matters to find out how the media operate, to understand what the media deliver in the end. Now, the next question I want to discuss is, if we are working for some kind of agency, just imagine if we're running a university, why does any public institution need the media?
Thank you. Actually, for instance, if you are starting a university, you need the media because they have a vision, and they're actually in that prospect to convey information or news to the public. So you would need the media to let the people get to know of the new university you are setting up. And you need the media in so many ways, maybe interviews, so that people will know the programs you would like to offer, so that people don't need to, because they might not know you because you are not so big. For instance, you are not the president to be known. So you need the media to get to be known. Thank you.
Well, I think basically because development agencies are embedded in a way, in one way or the other, are embedded in the political play, and they try to be influenced, and they try to come into, let's say, the governance scene, and the only way to do that, to my belief, is to do it with the people, by communication processes, and I think that's still not well accomplished, or not so assumed, let's say.
Yeah, I'd like to sum that up. As a public agency, or an agency involved in public life, we want to convince the public of what we are doing, and we want to involve the public in what we are doing. If we are a private sector business, we want them to buy our products. If we're a university, we want them to believe in our research, and we want them to send our kids to our school. If we are the municipal garbage management community, agency, we want the people to throw their waste into the bins and not drop them on the streets. So if we want to get this onto the public agenda, we want to get this into the media, because they disseminate that kind of information. Basically, we want our facts to be known, and we want our understanding of the facts to be understood. We want the public to know what our aims and goals and our mission is, and we want them to know who our leaders are. Why do we want them to know who our leaders are? Because those are the people that are likely to be quoted. Those are the people who are likely to stand for our agency. So that is a whole set of things that we want the media to convey. How do we get the media to do that? Robin, yeah?
I just have an interesting intake from the online community regarding exactly this fact. Adriana from Dortmund, who is participating, she just gave a brief input, and she says that the media as itself has an agenda and a view, and in her opinion, they work as another entity that has an own opinion, which may be based on facts, and ideally they try to cover both sides, but in the end they are more likely to convey their opinion. And she says that we as the readers look for an outlet or for kind of media which shares the similar opinion to ours. And yeah, she just wanted to bring this into the discussion.
Yes, I agree that the media are in the business of perpetuating the media. The media want you to get hooked on the media and to go on believing in the media, or to get you to believe in the media. And the more you consume media, the more they like you. So that I absolutely agree with. Apart from that, I think it's very hard to say what the agenda of the media is. To a large extent, it is reaffirming the status quo, because the status quo is the world as everybody knows that it is. So it is something that you can build on. The media do not have a privileged approach to truth, or to discovering the truth. They have to, the journalists always operate with a sense of half knowledge. They have a certain understanding of the issues because they've been dealing with the issues before. They know more than the general public because the general public only gets to read what the journalists have written, which is always less than they actually know. And they don't follow up the stories with the same sense of continuity. But the journalists never have the same understanding as the experts, because an expert, if you're a scholar or an expert in municipal waste management, you spend your whole day dealing with municipal waste. The garbage reporter from your daily paper will deal with municipal waste every 2 months or so. So there is a gap, but I think it would be it would be dangerous to say, well, the media are not credible because of this gap, and they should fill this gap before they make sense, because that is actually the process of transferring knowledge. The journalists are transferring knowledge from the experts to the general public, with all the distortions that the constraints of the business bring along. The trick is to try to get your points of view into the media in spite of their constraints, which is, again, we want to be heard, we want to be asked, we want to be taken into account. So let me repeat the question. What do we do to be heard by the media?
Oh, thank you. Okay. I'll say that we first have to, like initially said, get to know the time schedule of the media men. Whichever media you would want to capture your programs or something, sometimes you need to write formal letters to them. Try to communicate with them, because that's very important. If they don't know you, they might not be there, because like I said early on, you're not the president that if you have an accident, no one calls them, but they will be there. So you should get their time schedule and be able to know what they are interested in. And if you think, because all the media have, like you said, those who report the national news have interest of what should be in. There are some media for sports and other things. So you should study which media will fit into what you want to convey. Get your communication with them, get to know their timelines so that they can, capture whatever you want to be sent to the public. Thank you.
Well, I believe the first thing would be to maybe show them some facts they can probably don't know, or in other words, showing them the bad news to make them good news, and well, helping them selecting the adequate sources. I think that's basically what we as planners or executives can do.
Exactly. So the first thing, to summarize what you said, is to understand how they operate, and then to offer them things that fit into how they operate. It's very important to be proactive. Find out who the persons are that matter in the media. To return to the waste collection thing, it's not enough to know who the publisher of the daily paper is. If you're really interested in improving waste collection in your city and having the media help you, you want to know who the garbage reporter is. And you want to get in touch with that person. And you want to get your information to them. So you work with press releases. You organize press conferences. But you can do more. You can invite those persons to come and see your garbage processing sites. You can invite them to come along and do a report on how garbage collection actually works. You can offer them to interview your boss. If you can offer to give them an opportunity to interview the mayor. You can do several things to influence them, starting from informal exchange to very formal events. And of course you can use your own media. Today every major institution has its own website, so you want to post that information on the website too. You can use tweets and social media to get your message across, in the hope of reaching journalists and into the general media. Do you think it's a good idea to say, oh, we've got a website and we have our own Facebook presence and we have our own tweets and we don't need the media anymore?
I think it is helpful and it's important, but it's not enough. Of course, it's not enough, especially to reach different audiences. You cannot only rely on internet. You need maybe also more than just newspapers, especially when it comes to our countries. The rural reality is that people will rely probably in the radio or the community radio or other sources of information. So it is not enough with the internet, I think, but it's good to have it.
Okay, well, for me, I'll say that no, of course, if you have your own website and other social media, it's not enough, because you as the specialist or the agency, you are actually not a specialist or a specialty in that, because we have people who have studied and worked over sending information to the public over time, and they know how to go about it. So if you want to take that on you, you realize that your agency will be lacking behind, because the world is big, and I mean, we have a lot of so many things that comes to make the world, and your agency is just a little component that cannot be representative of the world. So you have to open up and get everybody like on board.
Yes, it feeds into what I said before and what we discussed before, that the media still have a gatekeeping function. There are some websites that are taking over. In the United States, BuzzFeed is becoming ever more important. There is an interesting new website called Vox.com, but they're actually very similar to the way established media work. Or Huffington Post is another internationally known website that is actually organized in many ways like a newspaper. Unless you manage to produce a lot of content on very many different issues, it is impossible to catch public attention of general interest. You can delve into your garbage collection blogs and you'll reach out to people who are interested in garbage collection, but that are not the only people that you need to improve garbage collection. So if you want to promote the cause of your agency, you need to get in touch with the media, and you have to provide them with the kind of information that they need. And you have to convince them of your own mission. If you do a good job of that, your chances are good that the journalist will consider you one of the two sides to every garbage collection story. And they'll start asking you. So then it means that you have to stay available. On the one hand, you want to be proactive to reach out to the journalists. On the other hand, you have to be available to them when they need you, which again means keep your website updated, because that's what they're going to check first. Make sure they have a phone number that somebody will respond. If they have a tight deadline and they want to know something and they call you and they get your answering machine and you don't call back, they'll probably not call you again because it didn't work. So it really boils down to a very personal interaction kind of thing. Understand the situation of the journalist you're dealing with and try to support him and her in their needs, and you'll have a corrupt little situation where this person will start helping you and you start helping him or her. Now, you can consider this corrupt because it's based on a personal relation, but on the other hand, it serves a public cause and it cannot be done without a personal relation. What do we need to do to make sure it is actually not corruption in an overboarding sense? There is a personal dimension to it that you cannot erase. It will always be there. But the important thing is to maintain trust. And the way to maintain trust is to play fair. So what we want to do is to give the same kind of information to all the journalists that are interested in our topic. To stick to the truth. Because if you start telling lies to people and they find out, the trust is gone. You want the trust because the journalists you're dealing with are multipliers for your messages. And if they don't trust you, they won't multiply your messages. So the information we have to give them should be factual. It should be comprehensive. It should consider both sides of the story. And then it becomes tricky again. You want to offer the journalists the other side of the story too, and suggest to them who to ask so they have a good source. Now, if the journalist is worth their pay, if the journalists are worth their pay, they will start checking whether your sources make sense and counter-check with others. But they will be grateful for that. So the more comprehensive a picture you convey, including the counter-arguments to your argument, the more convincing you can become. Make sure you're coherent and logical. One thing is allowed, though. You don't always have to say everything. If you know that your mayor is an alcoholic, you are not obliged to say that he's drunk all the time. You don't have to say the full truth. You can escape some touchy issues, like saying, you know, does the mayor drink too much? You say, oh, I don't see him that often. You know, it's not something you have to comment upon. But if it's really strictly related to your job and your mission, then you have to come up with the truth and with coherent information. Okay, what do we do if something goes seriously wrong? If we have a garbage incinerator and it blows up. If there's an accident in our garbage incinerator, do we hush up everything? There's something, the trick good media relations officers do in the situation of crisis is not to hush up the disaster, but actually to overstate it. There's an accident in the garbage incinerator, and you tell everybody, we've had a terrible accident, we're trying to get control of it, that is very dangerous, tell everybody to stay in their houses, shut the windows, we're trying to get control of it. And then 20 minutes later say, well, there's a big fire in the garbage incinerator, but you can open the windows, there's no immediate danger. And then you can start downscaling. But if you belittle the problem to begin with, and the story keeps escalating and getting worse, your credibility is lost forever. So if there's a real problem, go for it and say it is a real problem. It's more dangerous to understate the problem than to overstate it. Overstating is something that you can backtrack. You said, we warned everybody, we were not on top of the situation yet, we were not in control of the situation yet. We had to find out what was going on, but we are now very happy to tell you that was not at all as dangerous as we thought. It is an important aspect to presenting the truth in a way that is compatible with your interests. There is, of course, a very dark side to getting media attention. That is bribing the journalists, threatening the journalist. What are the downsides of the dark side?
Well, for me, I think the media, it's always much concern about their credibility. So it depends on which media we are talking of, because of course, if it's a national media, there's no way, well, they would like to take bribes or something to communicate what you want to tell the public. But there can be others, because of course they also need to survive and they can do something so that people will also trust them. But usually, like you said, the CEOs of every media is made known to the public. And once the CEOs know their credibility is at stake, they will always make their subordinates give out the truth. Because if they fail, they have failed. And no credible person would want their name worked over so many years to be in shambles. So it depends on the credibility of the CEOs of all these media. Then you can say that these people are corrupt or not. But I think every acceptable media in the whole world are always very much concerned about their credibility. Thank you.
I don't know this.
It is something, it's fathomless, it's a bottomless pit. There are countries where journalists get killed if they report the wrong kind of things. These kind of murders obviously undermine the credibility of the media, the credibility of the agencies that hire the killers, and very seriously make the profession of journalism much less attractive. But there are, as far as bribes go, it can be very, very confusing, because sometimes the journalist isn't even bribed, but the publisher is bribed. The government says, we'll advertise for something in your paper for the next 3 weeks if you cover this story. Suddenly you have to you end up covering the story. There is this thing of travel money, inviting someone to go somewhere and have them stay in a nice hotel for the time. Is the person being bribed, or is that something that is acceptable? The attitudes may change over time. If you're involved in public relations, in any kind of public agency, you have to know what is acceptable in the context. If people expect to be paid a meal if you take them somewhere, and if they expect to be taken on the ride for free, you have to take them there for free because that's what they expect. That's the normal thing to do. If you have a culture where the publishers will insist on, we pay for the travel because we are responsible, then you'll be, they'll say you're trying to bribe us. Again, you have to know how the media you're dealing with is operating, handling these things. And they can be very different. If you take the example of the Financial Times in London, which is a business paper of international reputation, in the late 90s when I was doing business journalism, they said, if a company wants us to cover their results conference, they better make sure we get there. That's what we expect of them. We're the reporters, so pay us. Whereas the Wall Street Journal, the closest competition, said, if we go to an event, we pay for the travel costs. Both approaches work. But the company, the publisher, should use them coherently and consistently, or else they become an element of bribery. And it's important, which is the thing I'm heading to again and again, that if you want to deal with the media, understand how they operate. What is it like in your specific context? Be aware of the pitfalls that are there and that may arise, but understand your partners, which is always a good advice. Are there any more questions?
First of all, there are some more inputs regarding the briefly mentioned crisis response. Once again, Adriana let us know that act fast and be as honest as possible. That is her takeaway from her personal experience in an advertisement agency. And she also has a question, and she thinks that, first of all, it is especially important to know to which audiences you want to address yourself, or which audiences you want to reach. And then she says how to reach them. So maybe there's different audiences and they rely on different kinds of media. And what language should you speak in this regard? So this is her question, and maybe you can address this a little bit.
Yes. We've been playing around with this idea of we're working for some kind of agency that wants to reach out to a certain part of the public. If we're in municipal waste management, to use this example once again, if I'm doing municipal waste management in Dortmund, I'm not very much concerned about waste management in Hamburg. So I want people who live in Dortmund, who have a bearing on my work. So that means that we have to focus on the communities we want to reach. Then we have to figure out what are the media they are using. What media are setting their agenda? Those are the media that are relevant to us. The media are not relevant as the media per se, but as the channel to get to the community we want to reach out to, which is something we understand quite well. If we're running a university and we want to attract more students to our university, we want to be read by high school students, parents, and high school students. We're not interested in other people. So we try to figure out what are the relevant media. That was one question. pick the media according to the communities you want to reach. The second question
the second question is from Miss Katrin Winkler from Stuttgart, and she says often the work, for example, of natural scientists are reported in journals which are not very popularly known or read by the common society. And she says that also reporting in these journals can sometimes be more different as in the common media, or just different in general. And so she's asking how can scientists attract the needed attention, even though it's a really subtopic regarding the preferences of the common society.
Yes, that's a very interesting topic. You can tackle that from an individual perspective or from an institutional perspective. Individually, if you're dealing with your own research, it will be much harder to achieve results than if you're acting as an institution. But the trick will be to find out what is the politically relevant angle, what is the angle that can get the public excited, and then reach out to someone who is in a position to reach out to that part of the public that you want to reach. There are several of the quality papers have science pages. Mostly scientists don't think very much of these science pages because the journalists who do them cannot focus on a special part of medicine, but they do humanities and natural sciences all at once. So their knowledge is not too profound. To reach a wider public, you need to figure out what in your academic work is relevant to the wider public. So if there's a link to, if you're doing chemistry, food security is exciting. If you get into health issues, that is exciting to certain people. If you're just dealing with the natures of law in general, it will be very hard to reach the general media with it. Then you're stuck with your science journals. As for institutions, like research laboratories or universities, I would strongly advise developing a media strategy to get information across. Is actually defining target groups you want to reach, interest groups, your own communities, your own constituents, and come up with a website that uses your own information and spreads it, and then reach out to institutions. So one way you can operate is to go through the local media, because the local media are interested in things that are happening here. I happen to grow up in the university town of Tübingen, and what happens in Tübingen University is a matter of concern to almost everybody in the city, because most people have some kind of tie to that university. Back then there was very little actual university coverage in the daily paper, because the university was considered to be highbrow and to be beyond the average person's horizon, which is bizarre in a university town where everybody's working for that. So there was a disconnect that actually the university can tackle. It takes both sides to tackle that. They've done a lot of that by now, and there's more university coverage in the local paper today. So there is scope for working at various levels. You can also decide if you're into technology, you have the industry magazines and the industry papers that are relevant. But for every single topic, you need to ultimately define your own strategy, because there's not one way to convey all messages. More questions?
Not necessarily directly related to the topic we were just talking about, but I think it's also a very interesting point, and it gathers a lot of attention in the community. Cynthia Arredondo Cabrera from Mexico City would like to have your opinion on online campaigns and what she calls clicktivism. For example, she mentioned the Kony 2012 campaign, or the hashtag Bring Back Our Girls regarding the captured girls from the Boko Haram in Nigeria. And yeah, she's asking if we overemphasize the role of social media, or how is your take on this, and what are your thoughts on this?
I don't know. These are things that are developing. We can't say, we have a very clear understanding of how local newspapers interact with local policy making and local politics. It's very hard to get an understanding of how geopolitics work, because it's much more complex and we don't have a profound understanding of that. And we do not have very much experience with social media so far. And the social media landscape is changing all the time. Not only the social media, the web activism. What seems to me apart from being puzzled, which we all are, I think there are some patterns that are emerging. And one is that social media can cause a lot of excitement, but that excitement doesn't necessarily lead anywhere. It can be a huge bubble of excitement that after a while is gone. The Nigerian girls have not been freed, and the excitement is a bit over. The hashtag is not dead, but the excitement is gone. Then again, there's been other social media campaigns that they call the Arab Spring for a time. They were speaking of the Facebook revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt. They were never Facebook revolutions. The revolution used the social media. The revolutionaries used the social media to coordinate, but Mubarak was toppled in Tahrir Square. Mubarak was not toppled in the internet. The internet was used to mobilize for Tahrir Square. There can be very profound impacts of social media campaigns, but I'm not sure whether those campaigns are always designed to achieve exactly what they wanted to achieve. The Occupy Wall Street campaign was something. Occupy Wall Street was invented by an advertising agency, basically, that wanted to protest the financial crisis. They were very successful in mobilizing people, but then the kind of direct participatory democracy with everybody having a say in every decision proved very cumbersome, and the movement petered out. So we did have a strong protest movement internationally. We didn't only have Occupy Wall Street, there was Occupy Frankfurt, there was Occupy London, there was Occupy just about everywhere. And some of the themes of that protest movement are still quite alive. The Occupy Wall Street campaign used this term of the 1% and the 1.1%, which is now very pertinent in the global debate. But right now it's become something that is driven by the French economist Thomas Piketty in his book about capital in the 21st century, which is kind of confirms on a scientific basis something that was used as a slogan before. It's very hard for me to say that, Piketty is successful now because there was this Occupy Wall Street campaign, and it is also quite obvious that Occupy Wall Street was not building upon the momentum of the book yet. So these things can add up to very great impacts, but it's very hard to say that A causes B, in the sense of somebody starting a hashtag and that resulting in a revolution, or maybe just online noise. That is very hard to say. What seems to be clear to me, though, is that if you want to get people to think about things and to have it reinforced, it's not enough to have a hashtag and have Facebook activism, but you need something like the Piketty book eventually. You need more profound communications than tweets. You cannot say very complex, you cannot convey very complex messages in 140 characters. And Facebook is very blurred in a way, because Facebook is used for individual interaction, to people, to be among friends, and it's used for political movements, like the Green Revolution movement in Iran in 2009, I think it was, when they were trying to topple the government. And it's very hard to boil this down to, you know, cause and effect relations. And the one thing I'm sure of, it's not enough to have a social media campaign. You need more serious publications on any issue to have a lasting and far-reaching impact. I'll happily go on answering more questions, but I'd like to sum up. I've basically covered the issues I wanted to cover, and I have a short handout that will be published in the webinar too, with 7 rules for cooperation with journalists. And it's as we've discussed before, it's know who the relevant media persons are. 2, if possible, establish contact with them and inform them about what you're doing and what the reasons are. And 3, be proactive. Keep them briefed and stay in touch with them. 4, don't only be proactive, but be reactive. Support them when they need you. 5, stick to the facts so you don't lose trust. 6, use the digital media and use them reliably. And 7, communicate in a simple language that they will understand. Try to move away from your own jargon and get into a more common understanding. That is basically my message for today. And if there's more questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Yeah, apparently the online or the click division issue is a big one, because again, Cynthia, she has trouble with this model of activism, because she says it accepts the tactics of advertisement and market research, or it accepts that the tactics of advertisement and market research that one could also use to sell toilet paper can be used to build social movements. So do you agree, and is this necessarily a bad thing?
It's nothing that worries me much. I don't think that something is wrong just because you could use it to sell toilet paper or other things. I think people are quite aware of whether they're buying toilet paper or becoming part of a social movement. I would always trust people to use their own brains and to decide for themselves whether they consider what they read to be true or not. And that is especially true if they're hooked up to other communities, which by definition is the case if they join a social movement. A social movement is a budding community, or is the result of communities interacting. Social movements are always built on networks, which always means that people begin to share views or find common ground, which means they are making sense of the information they are getting. Now, whether that information is brought to them via a campaign that is designed according to the rules of selling toilet paper or not, I think is of secondary relevance. That is not the critical point. The critical point is that you probably have to do something in a different way if you want people to start pushing for more equality, and which means higher taxes or whatever in policy terms, than if you want to get them interested in a certain brand of toilet paper. Yeah, that will be my answer to that question.
Not really a question, more of a comment from Mikania Kamilang. She says that she agrees with a lot of the things that you have said, and she just wants to point out that the language you speak is very important to convey the message, because she used to work in government institutions, and their task was to formulate the National Development Plan. But she says that this plan isn't well known by the public because the language is too high. So yeah, maybe you want to address this point or just give her some advice in this regard.
Yes, this is a very, very important and interesting point, because to a large extent, government bureaucrats use a language that is not meant to be understood. To a large extent, in German government documents, it's hard to paraphrase that in English, but it's always the political will being executed by measures in the context of efforts to promote blah, 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 blah. But there's never an agent that's actually doing it. It's never the ministry that wants something. It is always the execution of the political will of some almost divine creature, which of course is the government. A lot of information is phrased in a way that it is not obvious. It is obvious to the bureaucrats handling the matter, what it means, but it's not meant to be understood by everybody. A lot of technical jargon is, a lot of legalism is useful for lawyers to communicate with one another without other people understanding what's going on, because that's the way they make money. A lot of medical jargon is for doctors to communicate what's going on with the patient without the patient worrying too much about what's going on, so they use a language that is not too obvious. If you want to reach out to the public, you have to move away from that language, which is why typically German ministries now hire journalists to run their public relations offices, because the typical bureaucrat has learned to speak the bureaucrat jargon, which is not meant to be understood. So they want somebody to do the translation. And the easiest way for a ministry to reach out to journalists is to hire a journalist to reach out to the journalist, because the journalist understands the other journalists. Now, again, this is what I've been saying. If you're in an agency, in a position of responsibility, and you want to reach out to the media, you have to understand the media. And if you're high enough, you can hire somebody from the media to understand the media. But it is, I think it really matters to understand that the media are, the people who operate the media are just human beings who are working within a system according to the rules of that system. And whether they like the rules of that system or not personally, that's the way they operate. And if you want to fit into that, you have to fit into the way that operates. Whether you like that very much or not is not the point. You can disagree with the way the media operate, but still you need them to get your message across. So language indeed is a very important topic, and it is very, very important to have some people who are able to express your expert knowledge in generally understood language, which often means that it's not as precise as a scholar would want to have it. Because the terms in general language are not as well defined as they are in scientific contexts.
Thank you very much, first of all, for the answers. There's not so many questions coming in. It's more of comments. Adriana, once again, she just wants to point out that social media in her regard is a tool to support your cause. It's one of many tools, and but it's not the singular answer, and this would be a bit too short-sighted to just rely on this. And Ramon, also from Dortmund, he just has a comment regarding the power of social media, and his example is that the outcry that, for example, happened in Turkey when Erdogan blocked Twitter and sometimes also YouTube, and so he thinks that this shows that the growing power of social media to spread your message across.
I'd not be too optimistic about that. There's several downsides. The Arab Spring proved what a force social media can be as long as the dictators are not aware of social media. I'm not sure it's still such a good idea to express your opinions that freely on Facebook in Egypt right now. The new regime has been clamping down on all forms of opposition very stringently, and there is no doubt that they are observing social media much more attentively than was the case in the Mubarak years. So we've seen the force of social media activism at a time when many people were not aware, or at a time when those in power were not aware of the potential repercussions of social media campaigns, but they are aware of that now. And if you consider the amount of data collected by institutions such as Facebook, they become scary in themselves. My little magazine has a Facebook presence, and it's a quite frustrating thing, because we now have about 9,000 likes, and not all of our posts are displayed to all of those people who like us, because Facebook only displays them on so and so many pages. Now, my social media manager tells me if we paid Facebook more, they would display more of our posts on more pages. So there's this original spirit of free association of equals on social media websites is not what is happening today on Facebook anymore. We've decided not to boost our posts that way, but we do invest in occasional advertising to make the Facebook site itself more known. That is not the free kind of association that Facebook is originally known for. Twitter is different. Twitter is still much more interactive, but Twitter will become a business model at some point in time too, and we don't know what that will mean. We don't know what other social media sites mean. It turns out that it's very important to be, as a media outlet, it's very important to be on Google Plus and promote the authors, because Google knows that a lot of users use search engines to find authors. So Google has a preference to promote websites that promote Google authors. So if you're on Google Plus and promote your authors on Google Plus, your search results improve in the rankings for Google, because Google knows you're promoting Google authors. This again is not free association of individuals, but a highly manipulated power structure. And we're at the beginning of the internet and social media revolution, so it's very hard to say where this will lead. And we're getting into an intellectually challenging and interesting situation where, on the one hand, we demand data protection, and we don't want the NSA to know everything about us, and at the same time, we demand transparency of just about everything. Now, if we demand transparency of just about everything, it means that our data gets spread. This is something that we're beginning to deal with, and we don't know what the consequences and impacts will be in the long run.
The virtual audience is thanking you very much for this incredibly interesting input, and they're looking forward to the upload of the document in the AGEP Network group, so that they will also be able to have a look at this. And they think that the advice has been very, very useful, and many would like to start right away. And so far, I guess all the questions and all the inputs that have been made from the digital community have been answered. So from this side, I will like to return the microphone to you.
Okay, then I would like to thank everybody too. It's been a very interesting experience, and it's fascinating to see that there's response coming from as far afield as Mexico City. Apart from the 7 rules I briefly drafted, I have 3 books I would recommend if you're interested. One is The Economist Style Guide by the magazine The Economist. If you want to know more about journalistic language and keep things simple, that is the best place to go. Then there's a very interesting book by a German sociologist called Niklas Luhmann, The Reality of the Mass Media. It's not easy reading, it's systems theory, but he's very much into what are the constraints of any given system and why is the system operating the way it is operating in, and what can we expect of it. And the third book is the one that I already mentioned by Bill Kovacs and Tom Rosenstiel about truth. It's called The Elements of Journalism, what journalists should know and what the public should expect. These books are all quite demanding in their own right, so it's not easy reading, but if you want to follow up some of the, go deeper into the details of what we've been discussing today, I think all three of them make sense. That's why I recommend them. Yes, then I'd like to thank you all for your participation and your attention, and yes, thank you very much, and that was it. Goodbye.